Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that tries to make history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. For today's episode, we're going back to Russia, but more specifically, the Soviet Union, because I want to talk about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Most people by now have heard of Chernobyl. A lot of you may have even seen the HBO series starring Jared Harris and Stellan Skarsgård, among many other really amazing actors and actresses. But if you haven't heard about Chernobyl or don't know much about it other than what the name of the incident implies, then you are in for a treat today. In the early morning hours of Saturday, April 26, 1986, Unit 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in northern Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union at the time, exploded. It was not a nuclear explosion, but a chemical reaction that caused the reactor to melt down. It was, without a doubt, the worst nuclear accident in history. Way worse than when 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania experienced a partial meltdown in 1975. Way worse than Fukushima's disaster in 2011 when an earthquake triggered the tsunamis that caused the nuclear accident there, which I'm going to cover in the next episode. No, Chernobyl was by far the absolute most disastrous of them all. Today, we're going to explore the scientific and historical context of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I want to teach you about how nuclear power plants work, how the Chernobyl plant was supposed to work, how the explosion happened, the fallout, the Soviet attempt to cover it up, and the state of Chernobyl today. So, in short, we have a lot of learning to do. But Chernobyl is a fascinating case study of how human action can cause massive destruction. The science of nuclear energy is sound, but in inexperienced hands, it can be deadly. So let's take a look at the history of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. So let's start with the hard stuff. We need the scientific context here to understand what went wrong. I'm not going to use too much jargon to explain things. Let's just break down how nuclear reactors work, specifically the type that the Soviet Union was using at Chernobyl. And once we understand this, it will be a lot easier to see how everything went wrong. For you nuclear experts out there, I won't be giving every single detail of the physics and chemical reactions at play, only what we need to understand Chernobyl, essentially. So, first, what is the purpose of a nuclear reactor? Well, they're meant to provide electricity without needing to burn fossil fuels. Here's how it works. Like a steam engine, the purpose of a nuclear reactor is to heat water enough to create steam. That steam is then used to spin the blades of a turbine, which generates electricity. Steam engines work on the same principle, but by burning coal to heat the water. The goal behind nuclear energy was to make this process cleaner, and we do that using atoms. Nuclear power plants typically use uranium atoms. We use one particular isotope or form of uranium called uranium 235. 235 undergoes fission really well, which is what we need to happen for nuclear energy to work. Fission, essentially, is when you split an atom in half. In this case, uranium 235, but I'm just going to call it uranium from now on because it's going to get old saying uranium 235 over and over again. So when uranium is split, when fission happens, it produces heat, among other things. Immense amounts of heat. And this heat is what's used to boil the water, to generate the steam, to eventually produce electricity. Okay, that sounds great. So how do we make fission happen? How do we split uranium atoms apart? Well, we fire neutrons at the atoms. Neutrons are really dense and exist in almost every element, and when the neutron collides with uranium, it splits it, causing fission. Now, in addition to creating heat, fission also releases more neutrons from the now split uranium atom, so the process can continue. So, as long as we provide uranium as fuel and start the process of nuclear fission, it can continue on and on. There will always be more neutrons to bounce around once the process has started, and the reaction will generate the heat we need to provide electricity. But there are other factors to consider as well, like speed. For the neutron to hit the uranium atom and cause fission, it needs to be going relatively slowly, actually. Interestingly enough, if neutrons are flying around too fast all over the place, they are unlikely to hit their target. This means, for fission to work, to split the uranium atoms apart, we need a way of controlling the speed at which neutrons are bouncing around. We call this moderating. We need moderators to control fission. So, simply enough, we need to slow those neutrons down, right? Fission can only really happen when you slow them down. So, moderators are what we use to do this. Water is probably the best moderator. When superfast neutrons hit water, the collision will reduce the neutron's speed. For those of you interested in why, it's because of the hydrogen in H2O. Hydrogen's mass is equal to the mass of a single neutron, so when they collide, the neutrons slow down. Carbon, usually in the form of graphite, that works okay too. It needs to be pretty pure though. If there are other elements in there, like boron, the neutrons will be absorbed instead of slowed down, which kind of defeats the purpose. We need the neutrons to be bouncing around to create nuclear fission. So, most of the nuclear reactors in the world now, at least, use water as a moderator. Not only so it can moderate the speed, but also because water serves as a coolant. It helps keep the core, where the fuel is kept, from getting too hot. We can then also use this water to produce the steam, which gives us electricity. Water is the best moderator because it's also the failsafe. The water that moderates the speed of the neutrons is the same water that we're trying to boil to produce electricity. So if you lose that water, you lose the moderator, and this would mean that the neutrons will once again be bouncing around too quickly to create fission, and the reaction slows down. What we're looking for is to create chain reaction. As long as we start the process and we moderate it correctly, the reaction should continue on its own. We call this a negative void coefficient, which I know sounds super jargony, but this basically means that when the water boils off into steam, the reactor will lose power because there is less moderation. But let's talk about graphite moderators. If we use graphite or carbon as the moderator and water as the coolant, there could potentially be an issue if you lose the water. So let's say that the water's all gone. There's some sort of problem, or water's not being pumped in, the water is gone. Because the water is not the thing keeping the neutrons slow, the neutrons will still create fission even if you lose the water. The graphite is what's moderating the reaction here, keeping the neutrons at the speed needed for fission. That heat will keep generating even without the water, and without water to help keep it cool, there's nothing from stopping that reaction from getting hotter, overheating the core. It could lead to all kinds of problems like meltdown, explosions, steam pressure, all that kind of stuff. We call this a positive void coefficient, and this is important to understand what went wrong with Chernobyl. When there is too much fission, too much heat, and therefore too much steam, the reactor power will increase because there is graphite there to moderate the neutrons. So, in other words, the graphite moderators allow for fission to happen even if there isn't enough water. The reactor will just keep getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and power levels will rise. So, what happens if we need to control this power then? What if we make too many neutrons and we need to remove some? Well, that is what we have control rods for. A control rod is made of a material that absorbs the neutrons. Boron, which I mentioned earlier, is really, really good at absorbing neutrons. So if the neutrons are absorbed, they can't be flying around causing fission, right? So control rods exist to control the power of the reactor. There are other materials that are good at absorbing neutrons, but I'm going to keep it simple and I'm just going to talk about boron. So, those were all the main components of how nuclear reactors work. We want to create electricity by turning turbines, but without burning fossil fuels. We'll eventually run out of fossil fuels, right? They are a finite resource. So instead, nuclear reactors use fission to create the heat needed to produce steam and therefore electricity. Fission is when neutrons split uranium atoms, and we can make this happen by slowing down the neutrons using moderators. And just in case the reaction is happening too fast and we build up too much power too quickly, we have control rods to absorb some of those neutrons and lower the power of the reactor. And that's the gist of it, really. Hopefully, I've explained it in a way that makes sense, because to understand what happened at Chernobyl, we did really need that crash course in nuclear energy. So let's get back to the history. In the 1930s, physicists conducted experiments that created fission for the first time. Well, fission done intentionally by man, anyway. Italian physicist Enrico Fermi bombarded uranium with neutrons, which we now know causes fission. Other European scientists conducted similar experiments and got the same result. And essentially, I'm very much simplifying this because I don't want this podcast to be the length of like a college semester course. They found out that fission produces heat, right? So that started in the 1930s. This got the scientific community all excited, hot and bothered, because they recognized the potential for creating energy through fission, a self sustaining chain reaction where neutrons could break uranium to produce heat and more neutrons, which would theoretically go on forever and ever as long as you have enough fuel, enough uranium. The first successful nuclear reactor, where fission became self sustaining, went online in December of 1942 in Chicago. And this marks the beginning of the nuclear age. Now, unfortunately, much of our focus on fission and nuclear power went towards weapons, not energy. Why? Well, I mean, come on, it's 1942. That's World War II, right? The US was already engaged at war by this point. It's post Pearl Harbor. So the war is at the forefront of everybody's minds. You might recognize things like the Manhattan Project, which is when we developed the atomic bomb, cue Oppenheimer, right? But world events changed after World War II. The US unleashed nuclear weapons on the world with the dropping of two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and 9th, 1945, respectively. And after World War II, our biggest enemy was no longer Germany or Japan, but the Soviet Union. Let me explain why briefly. Since the birth of the US, we've been a democratic country founded on the principles of the Western Enlightenment. We as a country value capitalism and individual freedom. I know that we're also incredibly flawed, as are these systems, but that's not the point of today's episode. We wanted a government run by the people, for the people, but the Soviet Union did not. In 1917, a communist revolution began in Russia to take power away from the monarchs that ran the country. And it was successful. A group known as the Bolsheviks took power under Vladimir Lenin, and once in power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised to distribute goods equally amongst the people. Men like Lenin and later Joseph Stalin became the leaders of a state built on the premise that the Communist Party knows what's best for the people, and so therefore, the people must follow the party blindly. It was a bureaucratic organization built on secrets and lies, but one that became a powerful example to the other nations of the world who are anti capitalism, or at least anti Western, that there was another way. Shortly after World War II ended, the US and the Soviet Union entered into a period of heightened tensions known as the Cold War. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets recognized the US as a threat, one that had the power to destroy if we wanted to. So, they developed nuclear technology as well, both weapons and energy. But unlike American nuclear power plants, which were water moderated, the Soviet Union built graphite moderated plants. So let's turn our attention to the type of reactor used in Chernobyl, the RBMK 1000. Chernobyl's nuclear plant was a graphite moderated reactor. At the time of the incident, they had four reactors operational. Each contained a core of uranium fuel surrounded by graphite moderators inside this big cylindrical tank. So picture like a paint can or a water tower. And inside this tank were vertical uranium fuel rods surrounded by bricks of graphite to serve as moderators and pipes that ran water through the reactor core. Remember, we need the uranium fuel to undergo fission, which is why the graphite moderators are there to slow the neutrons down, and the water goes through to heat up and turn to steam. Water also helps keep things cool so it doesn't get too hot in there. Now, from the top of this tank, 211 control rods were inserted down into the core. The control rods are used to help regulate the power, right? They contain elements like boron to absorb the neutrons in case they multiply too quickly and produce too much power. And at any given time, there are always some control rods inserted into the core to help make sure everything is running smoothly. You never pull them all out. You need to be able to control the reaction. The whole thing was surrounded by a concrete shield to help block the radiation that comes from fission. You can't watch this thing in action as the process creates an immense amount of ionizing radiation, energy that can travel at the speed of light and will actually destroy parts of your DNA. Exposure to ionizing radiation for too long can cause your cells to weaken and die, which will lead to an agonizing death. Ionizing radiation can also cause cancer as your cells mutate and grow abnormally. Now, the curious thing about this setup, the RBMK 1000, as we discussed earlier, was the use of graphite as a moderator instead of water. I mean, at the time, nuclear plants in the US and around the world were using water, but the Soviet Union went with graphite. It creates that positive void coefficient. So, if all of the water turns to steam because it gets too hot, then the reactor will only grow more powerful. Remember that in our Western ones, the water is the moderator, right? So without the water, the neutrons move too fast for too much fission to happen. But this was not the case with Chernobyl. If something were to happen to the reactor and they needed to shut it down really quickly, they had something called the AZ-5, also known as a SCRAM. It's a rapid emergency shutdown of the nuclear reactor, a kill switch, if you will. If one were to push the AZ-5, in theory, all of the control rods would be inserted at once into the core, absorbing the neutrons, breaking the chain reaction, and stopping fission. Okay, so AZ-5 is the emergency shutdown. Got it. So now that we know the basics, what happened? What went wrong with the Chernobyl reactor? Now, if you've been paying attention, you might think it has something to do with the graphite moderator and the positive void coefficient. Something about the fact that even without water, fission is still going to happen, only getting hotter and hotter, generating more and more power. And you'd be absolutely right. But before I reveal the fatal flaw of the RBMK reactor, let's take a look at the night in question. It's time to introduce some characters into our story. The head of the Chernobyl power plant was a man named Viktor Brukhanov. A Soviet engineer, he helped build and run the plant. Though he wanted to install water reactors, the Soviet government overruled him in favor of their own model, the RBMK, only used throughout the Soviet Union. As is common with a lot of Soviet science and engineering, corners were cut, things were rushed, materials were defective. Adam Higginbotham, who wrote a brilliant book about the incident that I recommend you read, it's called Midnight in Chernobyl, says it best. Quote, "The quality of workmanship at all levels of Soviet manufacturing was so poor that building projects throughout the nation's power industry were forced to incorporate an extra stage known as the pre-installation overhaul. Upon delivery from the factory, each piece of new equipment, transformers, turbines, switching gear, was stripped down to the last nut and bolt, checked for faults, repaired, and then reassembled according to the original specifications, as it should have been in the first place. And only then could it be safely installed." End quote. Brukhanov was so overwhelmed with how poorly this construction project was going that he even tried to resign from it in 1972. But the Communist Party refused and sent him back to finish the job. The plant was eventually finished in 1977, and the fourth reactor was brought online in 1984. However, one thing that Brukhanov and other high-ranking engineers were not able to pull off before officially turning on the reactor was one of several safety tests. Under Brukhanov, who was in charge of the factory, was Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin. Brukhanov was given orders to carry out the test, who passed them on to Fomin. He approved the test, and they gave responsibility to Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. More on him later. Nothing to do with the Dyatlov Pass incident, by the way, in case you've listened to that episode recently. It's just a happy coincidence. So the test was all about power. In case the power went out, backup generators would kick in to keep the reactors running, which is great. But the generators took anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to fully turn on. So, what would happen to the reactors in that time? We needed to make sure that the water pumps were working to keep the reactor cool in that crucial time before the generators kicked in. The theory was that the turbines, as they were shutting down, would still generate enough electricity. So the test was to see if the residual energy could keep the water pumps moving while the generators were powering up. Fair enough, makes sense. Before the night in question, Burkhanov, Fomin, and the other men in charge had attempted this test 3 times, and the test had failed every time. Under pressure from the party headquarters back in Moscow, Burkhanov had to make this test happen. Fomin assured him that it would because their jobs were on the line, and so it was scheduled for the afternoon shift on April 25th, but it was pushed back because factory operators in nearby Kiev could not handle a drop in power in the middle of their workday. They had quotas to meet too. They couldn't just not have power for a while. So Fomin reached out to his deputy engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, who decided to run the test in the middle of the night so as not to get in the way of the Kiev workers. And this was the first problem. The night shift was not told that they were even running the test until they showed up for work that night. The night shift was not trained on how to run this test. And the night shift was a mix of both experienced nuclear engineers and newbies, practically brand new to nuclear science. In order for this test to be completed, the reactor had to be operating at 700 megawatts. Without context, this of course means nothing, so let me add a little bit more. The reactor was designed to run at 3,200 megawatts. To prepare for the test, the power level had been brought down to half capacity, 1,600 megawatts. It was brought to half capacity in time for the original start of the test, the afternoon of April 25th. But when the test was postponed, the engineers decided to just leave the reactor running at half power. Without knowing more, this doesn't sound like that big of a deal, right? Just produce less energy for a while, whatever, do the test later. But actually, it caused a lot more problems. Remember that fission is when neutrons split up uranium atoms. It's what produces the heat that later becomes the electricity, right? I also told you that during fission, more neutrons are released from the split uranium atoms. But in addition to the heat and the neutrons, splitting a uranium atom, among more things, also creates an isotope of xenon called xenon 135. An isotope, for those of you who didn't take chemistry or don't remember, is an atom with a different number of neutrons. Xenon normally has a mass of 131, so xenon 135 means that there are 4 more neutrons, and this makes it a lot heavier. It also makes it really unstable, and it's often called nuclear poison. Xenon 135 is the most powerful neutron absorber that we know about, and it comes from fission. Now, normally, when a reactor is operating as it should, xenon 135 will burn away. But if the power level drops or the control rods are in for too long and it lowers the power of the reactor beyond a certain threshold, xenon 135 will not burn away. So, what does this mean? This means that the excess xenon 135 will absorb the neutrons and the power levels will drop even more until the reactor is essentially dead. For someone trying to run a power plant, you don't want this to happen, right? So back to the test. Reactor 4 was running at half power for hours, about 10 hours, in fact. And in that time, since the power level was below the threshold for too long, xenon 135 had built up in the core. We call this xenon poisoning. The core was poisoned. Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov entered the control room after midnight and instructed his men to start the test. They were given an instruction booklet, but again, none of them were properly trained. The 2 men who were tasked with carrying this out were Unit Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov and Senior Reactor Control Engineer Leonid Toptonov. To help build my case that these men were undertrained, it's worth mentioning that Senior Engineer Toptonov was only 25 years old, and he was in charge of a nuclear reactor, which is terrifying. To begin the test, Dyatlov instructed the men to lower the power to 700 megawatts. Akimov and Toptunov slowly lowered the power, as they were taught to do, which took some time. But suddenly, the power started to drop unexpectedly. They didn't know at the time, but the xenon poisoning had started to take over at that point, absorbing all of the neutrons needed for power to happen. The reactor was in danger of shutting down, and it reached a low of 30 megawatts. Now, what they should have done was postpone the test. Once a core is poisoned, operators need to slowly bring that power up over a long period of time to burn away the excess xenon. It's it's like scuba diving. If you go really deep, you can't just shoot back up to the surface as soon as you're done because you're going to get the bends. Decompression sickness, nitrogen poisoning, basically. You have to slowly resurface. There's a whole process for it. You stay at a level for a certain period of time, come up, stay right. It's a whole thing. Like you have to take a course to be qualified in this because there's a lot of dangers inherent in the sport. So Professor David Ruzich, who is an Illinois energy professor, he describes the cardinal rule here. If the power is too low, you need to wait 3 days before turning it back up because of xenon poisoning. But Dyatlov, Fomin, and Brukhanov were under pressure to get this test done, so Dyatlov ignored all safety procedures and told the men to bring the power back up through whatever means they could. So, what's the fastest way to bring power back into a reactor? Well, we need the neutrons to do their thing, right? We need them to bounce around relatively slowly in order to create fission. So, the men removed almost all of the control rods that are designed to absorb neutrons and lower the power. They had just spent about an hour adding them in slowly to bring the power down in the core to run this test, right? But now they were told to bring the power back up again. So they removed all but 6 of the 211 control rods. And it kind of worked a little bit because it brought the power back up to 200 megawatts. And although it wasn't the 700 megawatts needed for the safety test, Dyatlov told his men to start it anyway. They shut down the turbines to do the test, which meant that the water was not pumping through the core as it was supposed to. What this did was actually just increase the amount of steam. There was less water pumping into the core, but it's still pretty hot in there, so the coolant pipes contained more steam than water. The steam filled the void left behind when the water was not being pumped in, and as the pipes heated up because of the steam, it only caused the core temperature to rise as well. This created a power surge, and there was no water to cool the core, and there were few control rods in to absorb the neutrons. But remember, there was graphite because the RBMK was a graphite moderated reactor. So you've got hot uranium fuel with graphite wrapped around it, meaning the neutrons are free to bounce around at the speed required to trigger fission, and almost no control rods to keep that fission reaction in balance. So, what to do? All of a sudden, the power started to dramatically rise, and the relatively inexperienced operators didn't know what was happening. Normally, control rods are used to moderate the power levels, right? But we know that the control rods, made of neutron absorbers like boron, are meant to kill that power. So they triggered the kill switch, the scram, AZ5, to put them all in at once. But what Dyatlov, Akimov, and Toptunov didn't know was that the Soviet control rods used in the RBMK reactors had a fatal flaw. To save money, the boron control rods were tipped with graphite, the same material that makes it possible for fission to happen. So when 205 control rods were simultaneously inserted into the core, the first thing that met the surging reactor were 205 pieces of graphite. And though the control rods are meant to reduce the power in the reaction, the graphite tips instead increased it. And it didn't help that the graphite tips displaced whatever water was still left in the channels, making the reaction even hotter. And the result was a steam explosion. The power surged so high that fission was happening at an incredible rate, and the resulting steam had nowhere to go. And so the reactor exploded. But again, it's not a nuclear reaction, it was a steam explosion. The roof of the reactor core blew its top, a 2,000-ton metal plate that exploded upwards and ultimately fell back down into the reactor hull, causing a massive amount of damage. Pipes were burst, walls collapsed, chunks of burning graphite flew into the air, landing on the roof and the surrounding area around the reactor building. Hot graphite, which was now exposed to the air, caught on fire. And then a second explosion occurred because the core was exposed. And scientists have a variety of opinions on what caused the secondary explosion, but the result is clear. The reactor core, now exposed, radioactive particles are flowing freely into the air, hastened by the graphite fire spewing out from the reactor hull. In the aftermath of the explosion, Dyatlov was in shock. Despite evidence to suggest the reactor had just exploded and the core was now gone, he refused to believe it. So he sent some men from the control room to manually open the cooling system, which would send water into the reactor, which no longer existed. In the process of doing so, many plant operators were exposed to incredibly deadly and high levels of radiation. For those of you who have seen the HBO miniseries, it makes it seem like they started to bleed and show symptoms of radiation sickness almost immediately, which is not the case. But many of the men who were in the control room and the men operating the reactor from the main hall died from acute radiation sickness not long after the incident. One poor man, Valery Kolemchuk, was in the water pump engine room and died immediately in the explosion. Pretty sure his body is still kind of trapped in there today, at least what's left of it. When the coolant system was manually turned on, all it did was flood the basements and hallways with contaminated water as the reactor had just exploded. And it was also incredibly hot near the reaction, so dumping water on the fire just turned it into radioactive steam as the hydrogen and oxygen separated and combusted. The local fire station was called and told to come put out the fire burning at Chernobyl. They weren't given any information about what had happened, and the administrators barely believed it themselves. Nobody believed that an RBMK reactor could explode. No one. The nearby town of Pripyat was built alongside the Chernobyl power plant. It was known as an Atomgrad, a town built only for plant operators and their families, closed to other residents. But within these Atomgrads, residents had everything they needed, including schools for the children. They had their own fire departments, right? The Chernobyl Power Station Fire Brigade was called out, but not knowing how deadly and radioactive the area was, they all absorbed lethal doses of radiation. One of the fire engine drivers gave a pretty terrifying account of the event, and here's what he described. We arrived there at 10 or 15 minutes to 2 in the morning. We saw graphite scattered about. Misha asked, "Is that graphite?" I kicked it away, but one of the firefighters on the other truck picked it up. "It's hot," he said. The pieces of graphite were of different sizes, some big, some small enough to pick them up. We didn't know much about radiation. Even those who worked there had no idea. There was no water left in the trucks. Misha filled a cistern, and we aimed the water at the top. Then those boys who died went up the roof. Vashchik, Kolya, and others. And Volodya Pravik. They went up the ladder, and I never saw them again. The firefighters were told to extinguish the fires on the roof so the nearby third reactor would not be impacted, and they managed to do so by 5 a.m. But the graphite fire inside the reactor hall, now just a crater filled with nuclear fuel, continued roiling. A team was assembled to sort out the mess, including ending the graphite fire, cleaning up the area, and trying to keep things secret. For the Communist Party, the absolute worst case scenario was the world finding out that Soviet science and engineering had failed. They particularly did not want their American enemies to know that. So, to that end, they shut down Pripyat's borders and kept the people there, trying to make it seem like business as usual. And it was 2 days before the party relented and evacuated the city. There were many members on this team, but the two we'll focus on are Communist Party chairman Boris Sherbina and chemist Valery Legasov. If you've seen the miniseries, these are the two main characters, played by Stellan Skarsgård and Jared Harris, respectively. The first order of business was to put out the graphite fire. It was pumping fatal amounts of radiation out every second, so they had to find a way of stifling it. Water wouldn't do. The fire was so hot that it combusted the oxygen and hydrogen in the water, just making it worse. Legasov came up with the idea of dumping a mix of sand and boron and other neutron absorbing elements into the reactor core. The sand would stifle the fire, and the boron would help absorb the neutrons. Sherbina made some calls, and teams of helicopters spent days dumping sand from above. It was hard though, because the helicopters couldn't fly directly over the burning crater of a reactor hull, so they had to use wind and try to dump it in at an angle, and they didn't know it at the time, but most of the sand missed. Regardless, they did eventually get the fire extinguished, but the danger wasn't over. To simplify and shorten the story a bit, they also had to clear off all the radioactive debris from the roof and the surrounding areas, mine underneath the reactor core to prevent the nuclear fuel from melting into the groundwater, and send men diving into the depths of the basement to drain all of that coolant water that Dyatlov ordered his men to release after the explosion. It was a logistical nightmare, and it cost the Soviet Union millions of rubles. But what really fascinates me as a historian is the cover up. The Soviet Union willingly let people play around in the nuclear fallout because they didn't want the outside world to know what happened. They didn't want to cause a panic. As it turns out, Chernobyl was not the Soviet Union's first nuclear incident. In 1975, a concrete tank at the newly built Leningrad nuclear power station, west of St. Petersburg, exploded. And less than a month later, a cooling circuit in one of the units broke, and contaminated water was released into the environment. Later that year, a fuel channel wasn't getting any coolant, so it experienced a partial meltdown that released radiation for about a month, and nobody nearby was warned, so people were just exposed to radiation. And it never even made the Soviet news. The reactor at the Leningrad plant was also an RBMK reactor, the first, in fact. The commission that investigated the incident did make recommendations for improving RBMK safety, but they were not implemented, and the whole affair was just buried. So, when digging into what happened at Chernobyl, scientists, along with Valery Legasov, discovered the truth that the Soviet Union knew about the potential dangers of the RBMK reactor, but didn't do anything about it, and told nobody about the fatal flaw with the AZ-5 kill switch. Why? Why would a government knowingly put its people in harm's way when the point of a government is to protect the lives of the people? Well, in short, power and control. Going back to the Cold War, our historical context, the Soviets were always in direct competition with the Western world, particularly the United States. They needed to prove that the Soviet model, a communist state kept under lock and key with the party controlling every aspect of its citizens' lives, was equally as advanced as Western capitalist democracies. If the Americans could build nuclear reactors and advance nuclear weaponry, then the Soviets should be able to do it better. The Soviets prided themselves on their secular commitment to science and technology. So to deny Soviet science was to deny the power of the state itself. So to tell the world that the Chernobyl reactor exploded because of substandard technology, that wasn't going to happen. Pripyat was closed down, and the party kept a close eye on the people involved with cleaning up. That is, until a power plant in Sweden detected unusually high levels of radiation outside its facility. They detected the kinds of isotopes and elements that only exist inside the core of a nuclear reactor, telling them that a nuclear accident had to have happened somewhere. And it didn't take them long before it was traced back to Chernobyl. Now, initially, the Soviets went on damage control, though they refused to outright admit that an explosion had taken place. Here's what their original message was to the outside world. Quote, "There has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the nuclear reactors was damaged. The effects of the accident are being remedied. Assistance has been provided for any affected people. An investigative commission has been set up." End quote. Doesn't say a lot, does it? Now, in addition to this, the Soviets started to give mitigating arguments, like how 3 Mile Island was way worse than Chernobyl. Spoiler, it wasn't worse than Chernobyl. This is classic Soviet misdirection, often called whataboutism. Instead of answering a question or criticism, the Soviets gave counter questions or criticisms. Well, okay, our reactor had an incident, but what about 3 Mile Island? Instead of answering questions about Chernobyl, they spouted information about how the Americans had messed up before them and how American nuclear power was weak in comparison. Remember, Soviet prestige is the most important element of the state, so the propaganda machine was strong to paint the Soviet Union above the West in all ways, including minimizing the severity of what happened at Chernobyl. As the cleanup efforts continued, the Soviets sent Valery Legasov to a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, in August of 1986. There, despite knowing that the RBMK reactors had a faulty design, Legasov pushed the narrative that the plant operators made errors that led to the explosion. And while Dyatlov and his men did skirt around safety protocols, which definitely was a factor in the event, the bigger problem was the graphite tipped control rods, which the state knew about and still didn't warn its nuclear engineers. Perhaps because he was pressured by the party, or because he himself was a ranking member of the party and wanted to maintain prestige, Legasov didn't tell the public about the Soviet government's cover up and deceit. It would have meant his death, despite his strong standings in the Soviet science community. He managed to convince the world that it was a one off mistake caused by human error and it wasn't as bad as it sounded. Later, in July 1987, several of the men involved in the incident were tried in criminal court. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov, the two men in Dyatlov's midnight shift that pushed the AZ-5 and triggered the explosion, had died of acute radiation sickness. But those who survived, including Viktor Burkhanov, Fomin, and Anatoly Dyatlov himself, were all found guilty for their role in the explosion. Dyatlov, perhaps the man most responsible for the negligence that happened in the control room that night, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for criminal mismanagement, but he only served 3. During the trial, the truth about how the Soviet state covered up the RBMK fatal design did come out, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to make it public knowledge. He was overridden, though, and the truth never made it past the courtroom. Such is the power of the Soviet communist machine. About the same time as the trial, Gorbachev wrote that, quote, Chernobyl made me and my colleagues rethink a great many things. The accident, its global discussion, and disastrous fallout across huge Soviet areas shattered the Soviet militarized mentality to the core. The lessons of Chernobyl called for the reversal of secrecy and xenophobia, for fundamental rethinking of security in the nuclear age. End quote. It's important to know the historical context to get a better understanding of why Gorbachev would so radically go against what the party believed about maintaining secrecy. Around this time, he was trying to enact a policy known as glasnost, essentially trying to make the state more transparent. The people were growing less trusting of the communist state and its secrecy, and Chernobyl only exacerbated the people's mistrust. Though Gorbachev wanted to enact change, the secretive Soviet state was less willing. Gorbachev himself was given little information about what happened at Chernobyl for several days after the event, which gives us a good understanding of how bureaucratic and corrupt the Soviet system had become in the final few years of its life. In 2006, so way later, Gorbachev attributed the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and the ensuing cover up as a major reason for the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, stating, quote, the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl 20 years ago was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl disaster, more than anything else, opens the possibility of much greater freedom of expression, to the point that the system as we knew it could no longer continue. It made absolutely clear how important it was to continue the policy of glasnost, and I must say that I started to think about the time in terms of pre-Chernobyl and post-Chernobyl. End quote. The cleanup, containment, and decontamination efforts cost the Soviet Union more than 188 billion rubles, equivalent to $2.9 billion today. This put the Soviet Union into bankruptcy, which was one of the inevitable factors of its decline. So, what's the state of Chernobyl today? Less than a year after the incident, engineers created a cover of sorts to seal up the radioactive chamber and all of the debris. Once the radioactive graphite was piled into the reactor and other cleanup efforts ensured that radioactive fuel wouldn't burn down into the ground, a sarcophagus, it was called, was constructed to seal up Reactor 4. However, much like other Soviet engineering projects, it was poorly built and started to show cracks not long after completion. Not wanting more radiation to escape, or even worse, see a chain reaction begin anew, a new containment building was built to cover the sarcophagus and the radioactive contents inside of it, and that was installed in 2016. It cost around 2.2 billion euros and was called the new safe confinement. It's supposed to last for 100 years, so I don't know, if you're still alive in 2116, let us know if it's still around. To this day, Pripyat and the areas surrounding the Chernobyl power plant are still unsafe. Tourists are now allowed to visit, but can't stay too long without risking dangerous exposure to radiation. The place itself has become overgrown, with wild animals reclaiming the land that was abandoned in the wake of the disaster. It's estimated that the area will be uninhabitable for a minimum of 100 years due to the amount of radiation and fallout from the explosion of Chernobyl's reactor 4. 100 years. Oof. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things. You can also subscribe to APHOUT on YouTube and check out Nedrick Music on YouTube too. He's my editor and the musician behind my intro and outro song, Yellow Cake. All the links are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.